basically, the structure of the day today will be I'll do a little bit of a context introduction so that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. And then we will go through interventions from all of our panelists today, and I'll introduce each of them in advance of their interventions. And then we'll go to Q&A. Which will be open to all of you as well. So you will either be able to ask your question by communicating directly, or you can ask it through the Q&A function. If you do have a question that you're afraid of forgetting, which is something that always happens to me, please do pop it in the chat at any time, and we will either be able to respond in writing, or we will collect it at the end and hopefully be able to respond to one of the panelists will be, or I will be able to otherwise. So without further ado, it looks like we've got a nice number of people. So I'd just like to start by thanking the OECD for facilitating a space for us to come together for what we're really hoping will be a quite timely session to consider this very particular form of retaliation that we're increasingly seeing used against workers in the garment and footwear sector when they attempt to assert their rights. Most particularly, this is a form of retaliation that seems to happen when workers attempt to organize collectively. So the criminalization of dissent and how that is being used to suppress rights is really going to be our focus today. And I should say, we've referenced the term SLAPPs, or strategic litigation against public participation. And that's something I think many of us are very familiar with across a number of different sectors, and something that perhaps is a little more new for us to be using within this sector to describe this particular phenomenon that we're seeing increasingly being used. And that's, broadly defined as the use by private parties. So often in this case, or these cases, I should say, these are factory owners legally retaliating through police complaints or other lawsuits against workers when they exercise freedom of association or freedom of speech or the right to protest. The reason why we chose this particular topic for today's conversation is not necessarily because it's a new phenomenon. I think for many who are joining today, this is something you will be familiar with, and certainly for our panelists, this is not new for the countries that they are living in. But why we decided to uplift this particularly was because of a negative shift that we've seen lately in terms of the response by brands when it comes to identifying the issue of criminalization of workers as a salient risk through their due diligence processes. And that's something which we find really flies in the face of the OECD's guidance on due diligence, which we know most brands operating in this sector purport to adhere to. So I would also like to say thank you to our wonderful panelists who are joining quite late in Asia at this time. And it's also always really wonderful to be joined by women leaders of very strong trade unions. So before I pass on to them, though, I just want to share maybe 3 elements of context to consider, just so we're all on the same page about what we're referring to when we're talking about criminalization. So first, when we're talking about the criminalization of workers or the use of SLAPPs, we are referring to this as just one category of retaliation that's used against workers or human rights defenders, a term that we might be using interchangeably today. And this is something that we're using that we're seeing used to silence dissent. So it's something that we at the WRC, and certainly for the trade unions who are on this call today, are really seeing as a violation of freedom of association. And the reason we're focusing on this one form of retaliation is because the OECD framework is very clear that due diligence simply cannot function where workers face retaliation for exercising their rights. And it's also very clear that companies must actively prevent reprisals and very crucially ensure remedy where they do occur. Yet, despite this very fundamental importance of freedom of association, as kind of the key enabling right. And I think we hear that a lot, the idea of it being an enabling right. And from our perspective, that's something that we see as the necessary precondition for the sustainable assertion of all rights in the workplace. And yet we've increasingly documented responses from brands that illustrate a lack of understanding of what violations of freedom of association can look like because they can be so incredibly varied and so incredibly context specific. So, why we are focusing on freedom of association and why as an organization for us, it's a form of labor violation that we probably document the most, or we document it frequently in association with other violations. And that's because of the really extraordinary challenges that workers face when they try to organize. I'm not going to stress that point because I'm sure for everybody joining today, this is something that you're well and truly aware of. But of course, workers consistently report that their biggest practical challenge to organizing is the fear or threat of repercussion from their employers or factory owners. And that largely has the impact of making workers simply too afraid to join unions or to raise labor abuses collectively. These kinds of reprisals take lots of different forms, most of which we're not going to cover today, but they include things like the fear of dismissal, harassment at work. So that might look like being demoted, not being given overtime, or being forced to do unpaid overtime, as well as fear of things like violence and beatings. I think it's also really important to consider here what that retaliation looks like through a gendered lens. So, particularly for women workers who are often the most risk of reprisals that are sexualized, the risk of unionizing or asserting freedom of association is particularly high. All of this kind of retaliation is, of course, in breach of all of the human rights and international labor standards, including the OECD guidelines. But what we do see is that there seems to be a failure of identification of these violations and therefore a subsequent failure to be able to remediate them. So, what makes the phenomenon of criminalization of workers so important in the context of today is that when we view it as increasingly possible in countries with rising authoritarianism, we have to also consider the fact that in most of the garment producing countries, this is a trend that perhaps has always been there, but is certainly increasing over the last few years. And I won't go into detail about that because hopefully that's something that we're all on the same page about. But in terms of considering what the impact of that rising authoritarianism is on workers, by and large, it's undermining the ability of workers to assert their rights under the legal frameworks in their own countries. And this is the same framework that brands claim to adhere to, in addition to their own codes of conduct. So, what needs to happen then when the political realities in garment producing countries threaten the rule of law and limit the ability of workers to be able to rely on the independence of labor institutions in their countries? These might be things like arbitration councils or labor mediation bodies, or the judiciary, which may become politically captured. When what we are requiring is just legal outcomes for workers in accordance with the law, but also in accordance with international labor standards. One thing that we see repeatedly that isn't considered is the political connections between factory owners and powerful political elites, something that we see in many different countries where garments are produced. But frequently we see this reality being ignored, and that ultimately exposes workers to false police complaints and also imprisonment as a punitive tool for daring to organize or speak out against labor abuses. This is something that for us at the WRC, we face frequently in the course of conducting dozens of investigations into labor abuses around the world each year. Yet overwhelmingly, despite our findings being rigorously documented through a framework of legal violations per local labour laws, we haven't found the issue of politically motivated uses of the law or police to be a hurdle in independently assessing evidence and arriving at findings of legal violations of freedom of association. What the issue is that this has not been the experience of many brands, and this is what our panelists will largely cover today. And what this has looked like, which we're going to hear again and again from all of our panelists today, is that in concrete terms, brands have failed to look critically at the employer story. And I'm sure many of you are very familiar with why that's necessary and what forms of underhanded ways in which constructing a reality of what happens can look like. We're aware of things like double bookkeeping that occurs for auditing purposes. We're aware of workers being coached before audits to say that things are compliant. We're used to employers doing things like creating forms or other forms of paper records in which they force workers to sign away their basic rights, whether that's severance, wages, or the right to organize. And the list could go on. The requirement of brands, and what we will repeatedly come back to today, is that in conducting due diligence, it is the responsibility of brands to look critically at the employer's story of what is taking place, like to go beyond the narrative provided by their factory partners, their business partners, and proactively scrutinize the evidence behind what it is that they're claiming when they say that rights haven't been violated. So today we're going to hear about, for example, what has happened in Bangladesh. So how workers, 48,000 workers to be specific, had mass criminal cases filed against them. We'll hear about how in Thailand, a migrant worker who spoke out against a factory's wage theft scheme was forced to sign away his legally owed wages or face retaliation when a complaint was filed by the factory against him, who was then forced to flee back to his home country of Myanmar. We'll hear from Soporn, who is going to give a couple of examples from Cambodia about how fabricated police complaints have led to situations of imprisonment, for example, of a worker. And we're also going to hear from Myo, who is joining us today from Myanmar, to talk about how police complaints against organizing activities in Burma have led to imprisonment of herself as well as other trade unionists in the country. So without further ado, I would like to pass on to our first panelist, Myo. I'm going to give a little introduction of who Myo is. However, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with her incredible track record of work over many decades in the country. Myo is the leader of the Solidarity Trade Union of Myanmar, which was founded in 2016. Before the pandemic and the 2021 military coup in the country, STUM had a membership of around 17,000 workers that was spread across Yangon, Mandalay, and the Irrawaddy regions. And since that time, she's continued to tirelessly fight for the rights of the country's garment workers, which I think at this point has a reported workforce of around 400,000 to 500,000 workers, most of whom are women. And due to her persistent labor activism, she's faced multiple arrests across the years, including a roughly 6-month detention in 2021 and a subsequent arrest just last year in July 2025, where she was then released in October of last year. I'm going to pass over to Myo, and for everyone, just a reminder to please make sure that you have your interpretation function on, as we'll be working with an excellent interpreter, Heyman. All right, over to you, Myo. Thank you so much.
ဖိတ်ခေါ်ပြီးကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်တူစီကျွန်မအင်တာနက်အခက်အခဲရှိလို့ကင်မရာပိတ်ထားလိုက်ပါမယ်နော်မင်္ဂလာပါရှင်ဒီနေ့စကားပြောခွင့်ပေးတဲ့အတွက်ကျေးဇူးထူးတင်ပါတယ်ဒီနေ့မှာမြန်မာနိုင်ငံကသမဂ္ဂခေါင်းဆောင်တအူအနေနဲ့ကိုရန်ကြုံတွေ့ခဲ့ရတဲ့အတွေ့အကြုံတွေကိုမျှဝေချင်ပါတယ်လူသမားတွေကိုကိုစားပြုတဲ့သမဂ္ဂခေါင်းဆောင်တွေကိုနှုတ်ပိတ်အောင်လုပ်ဖို့အတွက်တရားဖန်ဆီးတာတွေအမှုဖွင့်တာတွေကိုဘလို့အသုံးချနေလဲအာဏာရှင်စနစ်အောက်မှာကုမ္ပဏီတွေရဲ့တာဝန်ယူမှုကဘာကိုဆိုလိုတာလဲဆိုတာကိုပြောပြချင်ပါတယ်ကျွန်မကအသွေးစည်းညီညွတ်သောသမဂ္ဂများအဖွဲ့ချုပ်မြန်မာ STUM ရဲ့ခေါင်းဆောင်တစ်ယောက်ဖြစ်ပါတယ် STUM ကိုလူသမားသမဂ္ဂအခွင့်အရေးတွေအထူးသဖြင့်သမဂ္ဂဖွဲ့စည်းခွင့်နဲ့စုပေါင်းအရေးဆိုခွင့်စုပေါင်းတောင်းဆိုခွင့်တွေမှာကာကွယ်ဖို့အတွက်တည်ထောင်ထားတာဖြစ်ပါတယ်မနှစ်ကဇူလိုင်လမှာအာဏာပိုင်တွေကညှင်းနှက်တဲ့အချိန်မှာကျမကိုရန်ကုန်မှာရှိတဲ့ကျမရဲ့အိမ်ကိုလာပြီးတော့မတရားအင်အားသုံးဖမ်းဆီးခဲ့ပါတယ်တပြိုင်နက်တည်းမှာပဲကျမရဲ့သမဂ္ဂရုံးကိုလည်းဝင်ရောက်စီးနင်းပြီးတော့ STUM ရုံးချုပ် STUM Safe House တို့ကိုထိန်းချုပ်ထားပါတယ်ကျမဖမ်းဆီးခံရပြီးတော့နောက်3ရက်အကြာမှာကျမသမီးအပါအဝင်သမဂ္ဂရုံးမှာ SUN အဖွဲ့ဝင်တွေကိုဖမ်းဆီးခဲ့တယ်လို့ကျမရဲ့ဖုန်းကွန်ပျူတာစာရွက်စာတမ်းငွေကြေးနဲ့တခြားအသုံးဆောင်ပစ္စည်းတွေကိုသိမ်းဆည်းသွားခဲ့ပါတယ်တရားရုံးမှာတရားစွဲဆိုတဲ့အခါကျမကိုမတရားအင်အားသုံးဖမ်းဆီးခဲ့ရတဲ့အကြောင်းရင်းကစက်ရုံပိုင်ရှင်တွေကတိုင်ကြားထားတာကြောင့်ဖြစ်တယ်လို့သိခဲ့ရပါတယ်အဲ့ချုပ်လုပ်တဲ့စက်ရုံတစ်ခုမှာအလုပ်သမား3ဦးကိုအလုပ်ကနေထုတ်ခဲ့ပြီးတော့ SUN ကသူတို့ရဲ့အမှုကိုလက်ခံကူညီခဲ့ပါတယ်အဲ့ဒီအလုပ်သမားအငင်းပွားမှုကိုလူသိရှင်ကြားထုတ်ဖော်ပြောဆိုတဲ့အတွက်စက်ရုံဘက်ကသူတို့ရဲ့အမိသိက္ခာပျက်စီးရဆိုပြီးဆက်သွယ်ရေးဥပဒေအောက်မှာကျမကိုတရားစွဲဆိုခဲ့ပါတယ်အဲ့တိုင်ကြားမှုနောက်ပိုင်းမှာအာဏာပိုင်တွေကကျမရဲ့အိမ်နဲ့ရုံးကိုဝင်ရောက်စီးနင်းပြီးတော့ဖမ်းဆီးခဲ့တာဖြစ်ပါတယ်ဒီအခြေအနေကအမှုဖွင့်ရင်းဆိုတာကမတော်တဆဖြစ်လာတာမဟုတ်ဘူးဆိုတာကိုထင်ထင်ရှားရှားပြသပါတယ်အလုပ်သမားတွေကသူတို့ရဲ့အခွင့်အရေးကိုတောင်းဆိုတဲ့အချိန်မှာစက်ရုံတွေကတမကတွေကိုပြစ်မှတ်ထားတတ်ပါတယ်အဲ့ဒီနောက်မှာအစိုးရအာဏာပိုင်တွေကဥပဒေကိုအသုံးချပြီးတော့ပြန်လည်အပြစ်ပေးတုံ့ပြန်ပါတယ်စစ်ကြောရေးမှာစစ်ဆေးမင်းမြန်းတဲ့ကာလအတွင်းကျမကိုနှစ်ပတ်ကြာအနားမယူပဲစစ်ဆေးခဲ့တယ်အနားမပေးဘဲနဲ့စစ်ဆေးခဲ့တယ်ပေါ့တမကလှုပ်ရှားမှုတွေကူညီပေးနေတဲ့အမှုတွေငွေကြေးရင်းမြစ်တွေကိုရေးကိုတာမိသားစုအကြောင်းအထိမိခွန်းတွေကိုထက်ခါမေးခဲ့ပါတယ်တခါတရံမှာလူ3ယောက်ကတပြိုင်တည်းထဲမေးမြန်းပြီးတော့စိတ်ပိုင်းဆိုင်ရာပင်မနွဲနေအောင်လုပ်ခဲ့တယ်ကိုထိလက်ရောက်အကြမ်းဖက်မှုတွေလည်းကြုံခဲ့ရတယ်အဲ့ဒီစစ်ဆေးမေးမြန်းချက်ရဲ့ရည်ရွယ်ချက်ကကျမရဲ့စိတ်ကျမရဲ့ခန္ဓာကိုယ်နှစ်ခုစလုံးကိုဖြတ်စည်းပြီးတော့တမကလုပ်ငန်းတွေကိုဆက်ပြီးတော့မလုပ်နိုင်အောင်ဟန်တာနှောက်ယှက်တာဖြစ်ပါတယ်နောက်ဆုံးမှာအာမခံငွေတွေအများအများပေးပြီးတော့ကျမကိုအင်းစိတ်အကျဉ်းထောင်ကနေလွှတ်ပေးခဲ့တယ်ကျမစီကနေတင်ထားတဲ့ကျမရဲ့ဖုန်း iPad laptop အဲ့3ခုကိုပြန်ရဖို့အတွက်ကျမကမြန်မာငွေကျပ်တန်း60ပေးခဲ့ရပါတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့ကျမရဲ့လုပ်ဖော်ကိုင်မဲ့တရားအခုအချိန်ထိအင်းစိန်ထောင်ထဲမှာကျန်နေခဲ့တယ်သူတို့ရဲ့ကိုယ်ပိုင်ဖုန်းတွေ laptop တွေသူတို့ရဲ့ကိုယ်ပိုင်ကားတွေနဲ့တခြားအသုံးအဆောင်ပစ္စည်းငွေကြေးရွှေတွေအဝတ်အစားအဲ့အားလုံးသိမ်းဆည်းထားသေးဖြစ်တယ်ဖန်ဆီးမှုနဲ့အတူဖိနှိပ်မှုကလည်းမရက်တန့်ခဲ့ဘူး SUN ခေါင်းဆောင်တွေကိုဖန်ဆီးခံရပြီးရဲ့နောက်မှာ SUN အဖွဲ့ဝင် member တမကပေါ့ SUN ကနေပြီးတော့ကူညီဖွဲ့စည်းပေးခဲ့တဲ့စက်ရုံတွေမှာလူသမားတွေကိုအာဏာပိုင်တွေကဖိအားပေးလာတာတွေရှိတယ်စစ်မှုထမ်းဖို့အတွက်မတရားခေါ်ဆောင်တာတွေရှိတယ်မိသားစုတွေကိုချိန်ချောက်ခံရတာတမကရုံးခန်းတွေကိုချိတ်ပိတ်တာဒါမျိုးတွေစက်တိုက်ကြုံနေခဲ့ရတယ်တမက EC တွေကိုလည်းတန်းစီပြီးတော့အလုပ်ဖြုတ်ပစ်တာဒါမျိုးတွေလည်းကြုံခဲ့ရတယ်ဒီလိုနဲ့အမှုဖွင့်ခြင်းကကြောက်ရွံ့မှုကိုပြန့်နှံ့စေတဲ့အကျိုးသက်ရောက်မှုဖြစ်စေခဲ့တယ်ကျမတယောက်တည်းကျမတစ်ဖွဲ့တည်းကိုတိတ်ဆိတ်စေုံတာမဟုတ်ဘူးလုပ်ငန်းခွင်တွေအနှံ့အပြားအလုပ်သမားတွေအနှံ့အပြားအလုပ်သမားလှုပ်ရှားမှုတွေအနှံ့မှာကြောက်ရွံ့ထိတ်လန့်မှုတွေကိုဖြစ်စေခဲ့တယ်ကျမစီကိုဆက်ဆံဖို့ကျမယုံကိုမှုလာတိုင်ဖို့ကျမနဲ့လူရေးရဆက်ဆက်ပတ်သက်ဖို့လူတွေအလုပ်သမားတွေကြောက်ရွံ့နေကြတယ်အဲ့လိုဖြစ်အောင်လည်းလုပ်ထားတယ်ကျမကိုစောင့်ကြည့်တာတွေပတ်ဝန်းကျင်မှာအမြဲတမ်းဒီလုံယုံရေးကားတွေသွားနေတာတွေကားလာပြီးတော့ထိုးထားတာမျိုးတွေဒါမျိုးတွေကမကြာခဏတွေ့ရတယ်ကျမနောက်ကိုနောက်ရောက်ခံလိုက်တာဒီရုံးထွက်တဲ့အချိန်တွေမှာအရှိမယူနီဖောင်းတွေနဲ့ယူနီဖောင်းမဟုတ်တဲ့တွေနဲ့လာရောက်ချင်းချောက်တာမျိုးတွေအဲ့ဒီနေ့မှာဒီလာရောက်ဝင်ရတဲ့တမကတွေကိုခွင့်မပေးတာတွေအဲ့ဒီအလုပ်သမားတွေကိုချင်းချောက်ဟန်တာတာတွေဇက်တိုက်ကြုံရရတယ်ပေါ့စာရွက်ပေါ်မှာကြည့်ရင်တော့မြန်မာနိုင်ငံကအလုပ်သမားတွေကိုတမကဖွဲ့စည်းခွင့်ရှိတယ်လို့ရေးထားတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့တကယ်လက်တွေ့မှာတမကခေါင်းဆောင်တွေကိုဖမ်းဆီးတယ်နှိပ်စက်တယ်ထောင်ချခံရပြီးတော့ အဖွဲ့အစည်းတွေလှုပ်ဆောင်မှုတွေပိတ်ပင်ထားတယ်။ဆောင်ရွက်ပေါ်ကဂတိနဲ့လက်တွေ့အခြေအနေကြားမှာကြီးမားတဲ့ကွာဟမှုတွေရှိနေတယ်။ဒီအချက်ကလူခွင့်ရေးပေါ့နော်။လူခွင့်ရေးအတွက်အရေးကြီးပါတယ်။ကုမ္ပဏီတွေကဥပဒေစာသားတွေအစိုးရရဲ့ပြောဆိုချက်တွေအမိန့်တွေကိုပဲကြည့်နေမယ်ဆိုရင်အလုပ်သမားတွေကနေ့စဉ်ကြုံတွေ့နေရတဲ့အန္တရာယ်ကိုဘယ်သူမှမမြင်နိုင်ဘူး။အခုတော့မြန်မာနိုင်ငံကနေထုတ်လုပ်နေတဲ့ brand တွေကုမ္ပဏီတွေရဲ့အခန်းကဏ္ဍတွေကိုတိုက်ရိုက်ပြောချင်ပါတယ်။တမကခေါင်းဆောင်တွေကိုစက်ယုံကတိုင်ကြားမှုရဲ့နောက်ဆက်တွဲအနေနဲ့ဖန်ဆီးလို့ရှိရင်ဒါကပြင်းထန်တဲ့လူ့အခွင့်အရေးချိုးဖောက်မှုအနီရောင်သတိပေးချက်ဖြစ်ပါတယ်။တိတ်ဆိတ်နေခြင်းကဖိနှိပ်မှုကိုဆက်လက်ဖြစ်စေပါတယ်။အမှုဖွင့်ခြင်းကိုအရေးပေါ်အန္တရာယ်လက္ခဏာဖြစ်သတ်မှတ်ပြီးတော့ကုမ္ပဏီတွေကချက်ချင်းလှုပ်ရှားဆောင်ရွက်ရပါမယ်။ brand တွေကစက်ယုံတွေကိုမမှန်ကန်တဲ့တိုင်ကြားချက်ကိုပြန်လည်ရုပ်သိမ်းဖို့တောင်းဆိုရပါမယ်။ဖန်ဆီးထားတဲ့အလုပ်သမားတမကခေါင်းဆောင်တွေကိုချက်ချင်းလွတ်မြောက်ဖို့အတွက်တောင်းဆိုပေးရပါမယ်။အလုပ်ပြန်ခန့်အပ်ခြင်းနဲ့ထိခိုက်နစ်နာမှုအတွက်အပြည့်အဝကုစားမှုပေးရပါမယ်။ဖိနှိပ်မှုဆက်ရှိနေတဲ့နေရာတွေမှာဈေးကွက်ချိတ်ဆက်မှုကိုပြန်လည်သုံးသပ်ရပါမယ်။အလုပ်သမားနဲ့တမကခေါင်းဆောင်တွေထောင်ထဲမှာရှိနေတဲ့အချိန်ဖန်ဆီးခံရခြင်းအဲ့ဒီအချိန်မှာထုတ်လုပ်မှုကိုဆက်ပြီးတော့လုပ်နေတာတာဝန်ရှိတဲ့စီးပွားရေးလှုပ်ထုံးလုပ်နည်းလို့မခေါ်နိုင်ပါဘူး။ဒီကုန်းချုပ်အနေနဲ့အချက်၃ချက်ကိုကျွန်မအလေးပေးပြီးတော့ပြောချင်ပါတယ်။နံပါတ်၁ကလူသမားနဲ့တမကတွေကိုတုံ့ပြန်အပြစ်ပေးဖို့အမှုဖွင့်ခြင်းကိုတမင်အသုံးချနေပါတယ်။နံပါတ်2ကလက်တွေ့ကာကွယ်မှုမရှိဘူးဆိုလို့ရှိရင်စာရွက်ပေါ်ကဂတိတွေအထိပ္ပယ်မရှိပါဘူး။နံပါတ်3 brand တွေကအမှုဖွင့်တာတွေဖြစ်လာတဲ့အချိန်မှာပြတ်သားစွာတာဝန်ယူပြီးတော့တုံ့ပြန်ရမှာ။နောက်ဆုံးအနေနဲ့ပြောချင်တာလှိရှုရှုခြင်းကအလယ်လက်နေရမဟုတ်ပါဘူး။ဖိနှိပ်မှုကိုဆက်လက်ဖြစ်စေတဲ့ရွေးချယ်မှုတစ်ခုဖြစ်ပါတယ်။ကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်။ကျွန်မကိုမိကုံမေးမြန်းနိုင်ပါတယ်ရှင်။
Thank you so much, Myo Myo. It's such an honor to have you come and share your story with us. I'm sure that there will be questions that people will have for Myo Myo, and we will also come back to her for a second round before the Q&A. But I also wanted to just uplift, some of these very important points that were just made, particularly around how the silence really enables the oppression to continue, as Myo Myo said, because this is really something that was the case when these imprisonments happened last year with the documentation that was done. It was clear that there were links between international brands and the factories that had filed complaints against both Myo Myo as well as other trade unionists that were organizing. And despite that, what we did find is something very similar to what we're going to hear about shortly that took place in Bangladesh, which is brands stepping back from their responsibility or failing to recognize how their commercial relationships with these factories who had decided to take this punitive action against unionists in a country like Myanmar was something that they had to use their leverage in order to assist. And as Myo Myo said, this is a situation that is very, very concerning, and where there are still many in jail as we speak right now. So we'll come back to how that can be addressed after a few more speakers. So I'd now like to introduce Nazma. So Nazma, unfortunately, is not joining us in person today. We had a last minute change due to some illness and issues with flights. But thankfully, Nazma agreed to read out her intervention on video, which I'll share in a moment after a brief introduction. So Nazma Akhtar is a leading Bangladeshi labor activist and trade union leader. She began working in garment factories at the age of 11 and has advocated for garment worker rights for over 3 decades. She founded the SGSF trade union in the early 1990s and the Awaj Foundation, which is a sister NGO, in 2003. They have successfully negotiated around 20 factory-level collective bargaining agreements in factories, and this includes just 5 in 2025 alone, which is an incredible achievement. This has left them with around 200,000 workers organized in 50 factories. And that's a really significant contribution in the context of Bangladesh, where there's an estimated only 3 to 5% of the workforce that are part of a union. SGSF was the key union that documented criminal cases that were filed against 48,000 workers during the last round of minimum wage protests in Bangladesh. They worked closely with the Solidarity Centre and with us at the WRC to pull together the links with brands. So these were international brands that were sourcing from or had a business relationship with factories that had opted to file criminal complaints, either naming workers or trade unionists, but also, really crucially in this context, large numbers of unnamed workers. And the impact of that is largely that it would mean that any worker was therefore under threat of being arrested under these outstanding criminal complaints. So it was a huge amount of work that was conducted within Bangladesh by a large number of trade unions and other advocates within the country, as well as something that garnered a huge amount of international attention and solidarity, with the focus being primarily on these 45 brands that were linked to these complaints. And as Nazma will share, the response was far less than what we would have hoped for, given the commitments that have been made by most of these brands to respect freedom of association and to remediate when such harms occur. I would also like to say that Nazma speaks Bangla, and a language that many of us sadly don't speak because it's a beautiful language. And in this situation, we translated her written notes in Bangla through to English, and she has heroically opted to read them in English, which is what we're going to see now. So Nazma is not with us, but I want to send a big thank you to her for choosing to do that. And I'll have my colleague play her video now. And yeah, if there are any issues with anyone being able to hear it, please flag it in the Q&A.
Hello everyone, thank you very much to part of this panel, and I'm happy to be part of this session, and I speak alongside with my sisters from across the region. I'm speaking today as a trade unionist from Bangladesh, SGSF, and I wanted to explain what criminalization of workers look like in Bangladesh, especially for women workers. In Bangladesh, criminalization of workers cannot be understood as isolated legal event. It must be understood as part of barrier system of retaliation against the workers exercise freedom of association. Under the provision of government, civic space narrowing significantly. In environment where democracy institution weaken, workers' organization is often treated as a threat to public order rather than a protect the rights. In this context, the line between law enforcement and political enforcement can be blurred. So, when workers organize, especially around waste, the response has often been predictable: intimidation, dismissal, violence, and criminalization. Criminalization in Bangladesh is not only about the police complaints filed by the factories, it is an ecosystem and repression. This includes higher goons or informal violence used to intimidate workers, leaders, and it is included targeted arrested of the union organizing using the fake charges. All of those tools serve the same purpose: to silence dissent and prevent workers from building collective power. And this matters because freedom of association is not just one labor rights among any. Without freedom of association, workers cannot defend any other rights, not wages, not safety, no protection from violence or harassment. This is especially true for women's workers. In this garment sector, women are the majority of the workforce. But women workers face gender retaliation, humiliation, sexual harassment, threat to their families, and reputational attack designed to isolate them. When women are alone, they are extremely vulnerable. But when women organize collectively, they can push back, they can demand dignity. Let me give you the example. At a factory called Golden Refit Garments in Gazipur, women workers were facing severe gender-based violence and harassment. Manager and supervisor used sexual insult and threats to humiliate women workers and force them to meet production target. Workers were also required to perform off-the-clock work, including mandatory meeting outside paid hour without compensation. Workers raise complaint and investigation documented this violation. The buyer Colosseum was pressed to act, and to its credit, it required the supplier to implement remedy. But what made this remediation sustainable was not only disciplinary action. What made it durable was workers' organization. During the remediation process, workers formed union affiliate with HGSF. They negotiated a binding agreement with management. As a result, managers responsible for abuse were removed or disciplined. The factory agreed to long-term structure, protection, and independent grievance mechanism, a permanent labor management oversight body with majority women representation, and training delivered by an independent organization chosen with workers' involvement. A worker lead at the factory described the change simply: women workers will now have dignity and respect as human beings. Turn fear into accountability. It's turned individually vulnerability into collective power. And this is why unionize in Bangladesh is so difficult, and why it is such a major achievement when workers succeed. Workers who try to organize face dismissal, blacklisted across the factory, police intimidation, and sometimes violence. And because garments workers' life very close to poverty, even a short loss of wage can threaten survival. So, organizing requires anonymous courage. Despite this, workers have built real union power. Through HGSF, more than 200,000 workers are union members and more than 70% are women. HGSF support dozens of workers, lead factory union with democracy, election, leadership, overwhelming women at the factory level. HGS also has factory unions that have negotiated collective bargaining agreement cover more than 40,000 workers. These are workers lead dues paying factory unions. Every one of them represent workers, creating democracy space inside workplace where they could not before. To understand why criminalization is used, we must also connect it to ways and business models. Bangladesh has a repeated cycle. During the minimum wage process, workers demand wage they can live on. But wage setting process have historically excluded meaningful workers' voice. Protests grow, and then repression follows: violence, arrested, dismissal, and mass criminalized complaints. We saw this pattern in 2016 and 2018, and again in 2023. During the protest over the minimum wage outcome, workers face extreme repression, mass criminal cases were filed by factories producing for many big international brands. Thousands of workers were at risk of arrested. This created a chilling effect on workers organizing. After the collapse of the previous government, Bangladesh has entered a transitional period. Recently, the interim government challenges mass criminal cases affecting more than 48,000 workers after nearly 2 years of organizing and advocacy, but more cases have been filed since that time, showing that the police companies are still being used by factories to silence and scare workers as Bangladesh goes into an election. The key question is whether we experience of workers who are constantly criminalized for arresting their rights can be addressed. The greatest risk to the garment sector in the lack of protection of workers to organize. When workers are criminalized, unions are weakened. When unions are weakened, wages stay low and other rights are behind. And when democracy is under threat, it is easier exploitation to continue. This is why the role of global brand is so important to end criminalization and protect freedom of association. Brands have leverage that can support repression or stop it. Thank you so much to listening me. For workers,
I just want to say a huge thank you to Nazma for recording that and for my wonderful colleagues in South Asia for doing the translation from Bangla. It was really so important for us to ensure that her words were shared about this phenomenon that's impacting Bangladesh now, given that it's such a key exporting country when it comes to apparel and footwear. And I just want to really uplift, the point, which I think is really illustrated well by what she was saying in terms of how the commercial practices of brands very frequently undermine their own policy commitments to respecting rights such as freedom of association. And this case study that she showed of how workers were left with absolutely no avenue but to protest on the streets or strike in order to lift their poverty wages, given that the lack of representation that they had in the wage negotiation, that repression was something that we all saw coming, unfortunately, and something that the brands were very slow to respond on, despite the fact that it was a risk that was predictable, that was something that they could have warned their factory suppliers against in advance. That was something that simply didn't happen. And of course, when we think about what the root causes are of the poverty level wages, which are reflected by the minimum wage levels across most of the garment producing countries, it is, of course, also a product of the very, very low prices that brands choose to pay suppliers. and the very limited ability for suppliers to be able to meaningfully negotiate prices upwards. And that price squeeze is something that, of course, then translates into a squeeze on rights. So both on wages for workers as well as their corresponding rights. And we see that play out, of course, in things like very high production targets, unsafe workplaces, and abuse from managers pushing workers to work faster and faster. If there is a desire to have a little bit more information about that case that Nazma shared about the Golden Refit case, that's on our website, and we can also send around an email to everyone so that you have the links to that. I'd now like to introduce our next panelist, Yang Sopon, who I'm so glad is joining us today from Cambodia. She's the president of the Cambodian Alliance of Trade Unions, or CATU, which is a trade union federation in Cambodia that represents workers in the manufacturing sector. She was part of its formation and has led as the elected president since 2011. A former garment worker herself, she has been an incredibly formidable representative of workers for more than 20 years in the country. She supported thousands of workers to organize collectively in asserting their rights under increasingly constrained conditions. In Cambodia, for background for everyone listening, there are more than 800,000 garment workers. Most of them are women, with a minimum wage as of this year of around $210 per month, or that works out to roughly $8 a day. Katu has more than 10,000 members across 20 factories, with another 10 factory unions pending registration approval. I'll now pass on to Sapon, and again, for everyone, just make sure that you've got your interpretation channels to the language that you'd like to listen in. Okay, over to you.
ជាដំបូងសូមគោរពនិងសូមជំរាបសួរទៅដល់បងប្អូនទាំងអស់គ្នាដែលមានវត្តមាននៅទីនេះហើយអរគុណមែនទែនដែលបានអនុញ្ញាតឲ្យខ្ញុំបានមានឱកាសនៅក្នុងការលើកឡើងអំពីបញ្ហាឬក៏ចែករំលែកទៅលើបរិបទថ្មីដែលនៅក្នុងប្រទេសកម្ពុជាដែលបង្ហាញអំពីយ៉ាងច្បាស់អំពីការប្រើប្រាស់ប្រព័ន្ធតុលាការចំពោះការធ្វើទុកបុកម្នេញកំពុងតែប្រព្រឹត្តទៅមកដល់កម្មករយុវជនដែលកំពុងអនុវត្តសិទ្ធិជាមូលដ្ឋានរបស់ខ្លួនអញ្ចឹងណាថ្មីហ្នឹងគឺខ្ញុំលើកអំពីរឿងករណីក្រុមហ៊ុនមួយដែលជាករណីយងចាក់វិនស្តាស៊ូដែលកន្លងមកនៅពេលដែលយើងដំណើរការនៅក្នុងការចងក្រងសហជីពគឺត្រូវបានក្រុមហ៊ុនហ្នឹងប្រើប្រាស់ប្រព័ន្ធតុលាការនៅក្នុងការប្តឹងមេដឹកនាំសហជីពមួយរូបដែលកម្មករយុវជនរបស់យើងគាត់បានបោះឆ្នោតឲ្យគាត់គឺឈ្មោះលោកជាច័ន្ទដែលក្នុងនោះខ្ញុំអាចលើកបានថាច័ន្ទនៅពេលដែលគាត់ចូលរួមនៅក្នុងការចងក្រងជាមួយការទូគឺគាត់ត្រូវបានកម្មករយុវជននៅក្នុងការគ្រប់គ្រងគាត់បន្ទាប់ពីយើងមានការជូនដំណឹងទៅក្រុមហ៊ុនយើងឃើញថាក្រុមហ៊ុនបានប្រើប្រាស់ប្រព័ន្ធតុលាការនៅក្នុងការប្តឹងលោកជាច័ន្ទឲ្យគាត់ជាប់ពន្ធនាគារហើយក្នុងនោះយើងមើលឃើញថានៅក្នុងករណីរោងចក្រ Winstar ស៊ូហ្នឹងគឺនៅក្នុងក្រុមហ៊ុនហ្នឹងគឺមានកម្មករយុវជនប្រមាណចិត្តប្រហែលជា22000នាក់អញ្ចឹងណាហើយក្រុមហ៊ុនហ្នឹងបានផលិតឲ្យក្រុមហ៊ុនម៉ាកយីហោអន្តរជាតិធំល្បីអញ្ចឹងណាហើយនៅពេលនៅក្នុងឆ្នាំ2004ខែមករាលោកជាច័ន្ទត្រូវបានជ្រើសតាំងដោយមិត្តរួមការងារបានក្លាយខ្លួនទៅជាមេដឹកនាំសហជីពរបស់ការទូតនៅថ្នាក់មូលដ្ឋានបន្ទាប់ពីមួយសប្តាហ៍ពីរសប្តាហ៍មកគឺគាត់ត្រូវបានគេចាប់ខ្លួនដោយប្រើហិង្សានៅកន្លែងការងាររបស់គាត់ហើយអ្នកគ្រប់គ្រងបានដាក់ពាក្យបណ្ដឹងព្រហ្មទណ្ឌទៅតុលាការដើម្បីប្រឆាំងទៅនឹងគាត់ហើយគេបានប្រើយុទ្ធសាស្ត្រហ្នឹងចង់និយាយថាគេបានប្រើយុទ្ធសាស្ត្រឬក៏រូបភាពបែបហ្នឹងយ៉ាងទូលំទូលាយនៅក្នុងប្រទេសកម្ពុជាដែលបង្ហាញអំពីការគំរាមកំហែងសិទ្ធិរបស់កម្មករយុវជនដែលបំផ្លាញការរៀបចំសហជីពដោយឃោរឃៅបំផុតទៅលើសហជីពតែឯករាជ្យនៅក្នុងស្រុកខ្មែរយើងអញ្ចឹងណា ហើយលោកជាច័ន្ទត្រូវបានឃុំខ្លួនរយៈពេល6 ខែដោយអយុត្តិធម៌ដោយគ្មានមូលដ្ឋាននិងគ្មានភស្តុតាងហើយការរៀបចំរបស់ក្រុមហ៊ុនហ្នឹងដោយគ្មានភស្តុតាងអ្វីទាំងអស់ប៉ុន្តែការខូចខាតដែលបានកើតឡើងភ្លាមធ្ងន់ធ្ងរនៅក្នុងកំឡុងពេលដែលច័ន្ទត្រូវបានជាប់ឃុំឃាំងហ្នឹងគឺទី1គឺមានបញ្ហាពាក់ព័ន្ធជាមួយបញ្ហាសុខភាពរបស់គាត់ដែលគាត់ឈឺពេលមុនដែលគាត់ជាប់ពន្ធនាគារហ្នឹងរហូតដល់ក្នុងកំឡុងពេលដែលមានការចាប់ខ្លួនគាត់ហ្នឹងគឺស្ថានភាពរបស់គាត់នៅពេលដែលគាត់ជាប់ពន្ធនាគារហ្នឹងយើងឃើញថាពួកគាត់មានស្ថានភាពពិបាកមែនទែននៅក្នុងពន្ធនាគារធ្វើឲ្យសុខភាពរបស់គាត់មានការធ្លាក់ចុះហើយបន្ទាប់មកក្រុមគ្រួសារគាត់ប្រឈមទៅនឹងការបាត់បង់ប្រាក់ចំណូលរហូតដល់មានការលក់របស់របរដែលគាត់ធ្លាប់មានពីមុនរហូតដល់គាត់សម្រេចចិត្តចុងក្រោយនៅក្នុងការលក់ដីដែលពុកម្ដាយរបស់គាត់បានចែកឲ្យគាត់ដោយសារតែគាត់ត្រូវបានជាពាក់បំណុលគេហើយគាត់មានកូននៅក្នុងបន្ទុករហូតដល់កូន3នាក់ហើយបន្ទាប់មកគាត់មានឪពុកម្ដាយចាស់ជរាហើយប្រពន្ធគាត់ផ្គត់ផ្គង់ជីវភាពមិនគ្រប់គ្រាន់អញ្ចឹងនៅក្នុងរោងចក្រហ្នឹងគឺនៅពេលបន្ទាប់ពីមានការចាប់ខ្លួនច័ន្ទនៅក្នុងរោងចក្រហ្នឹងគឺកម្មករយោជិកគឺមានការភ័យខ្លាចខ្លាំងមែនទែនព្រោះពេលដែលមានការចាប់ខ្លួនគាត់ចឹងទៅវាធ្វើឲ្យបញ្ហាហ្នឹងរីករាលដាលយ៉ាងឆាប់រហ័សទៅដល់កម្មករយោជិកចឹងណាហើយកម្មករមើលឃើញថាសំបីតែការបង្កើតសហជីពដោយសន្តិវិធីក៏អាចឈានទៅដល់ក្នុងការចាប់ខ្លួនការឃុំខ្លួនគាត់ហើយមនុស្សភាគច្រើនមានអារម្មណ៍ថាมันមានលទ្ធភាពណាមួយដើម្បីកែលម្អលក្ខខណ្ឌការងារដោយសហការគ្នានោះទេអញ្ចឹងណានេះគឺជាផលប៉ះពាល់នៃការប្រើប្រាស់ការចោទប្រកាន់ផ្លូវតុលាការបទព្រហ្មទណ្ឌមកលើមេដឹកនាំសហជីពឯករាជ្យការពារសិទ្ធិកម្មករយោជិតពិតប្រាកដវាមិនត្រឹមតែផ្ដន្ទាទោសមនុស្សម្នាក់ទេវាបង្កើតឲ្យមានបរិយាកាសភ័យខ្លាចទៅដល់កម្មករយោជិកនៅក្នុងប្រទេសកម្ពុជាទាំងមូលសូម្បីតែបន្ទាប់ពីមានការផ្ដន្ទាទោសត្រូវបន្ទាប់ពីមានការសាលក្រមផ្ដន្ទាទោសត្រូវបានលុបចោលដោយគ្មានភស្តុតាងការរើសអើងនិងការសងសឹកនៅតែបន្តដោយសារជាក់ស្ដែងនេះបើយើងមើលឃើញត្បិតរដ្ឋាច័ន្ទគាត់ត្រូវបានមានការដោះលែងឲ្យនៅក្រៅឃុំប៉ុន្តែអឺគេព្យាយាមនៅក្នុងការធ្វើទុកបុកម្នេញសហជីពនៅក្នុងរោងចក្រវិនស្តាស៊ូនឹងនៅពេលដែលយើងមានសហជីពនៅពេលដែលយើងបានចេញបញ្ជីការពីក្រសួងនៅពេលដែលយើងមានបញ្ជីការយើងចាប់ដើមប្រមូលសមាជិកប្រមូលអីហ្នឹងឥឡូវមកដល់ពេលបច្ចុប្បន្ននេះសមាជិកដែលយើងបានប្រមូលរាប់ពាន់នាក់គឺអត់ត្រូវបានក្រុមហ៊ុនធ្វើការកាត់លុយភាគទានឲ្យមកសហជីពមូលដ្ឋានយើងនៅរោងចក្រវិនស្តាស៊ូទេអញ្ចឹងណាត្រឡប់មកវិញអ្នកគ្រប់គ្រងរោងចក្រមិនបានដាក់ឲ្យលោកជាច័ន្ទហ្នឹងត្រឡប់ទៅតួនាទីដើមវិញទេនៅពេលដែលគាត់ត្រូវបានមានការដោះលែងមុនដំណាក់កាលដំបូងណាហើយផ្ទុយទៅវិញហ្នឹងគាត់ត្រូវបានដាក់ឲ្យធ្វើការនៅអាគារខាងក្រៅក្រុមហ៊ុនអស់រយៈពេលដល់អស់រយៈពេល1 ឆ្នាំជិត1 ឆ្នាំដោយបំបែកចេញអំពីកម្មករផ្សេងទៀតដើម្បីកាត់បន្ថយសិទ្ធិអំណាចរបស់សហជីពនេះជាការបង្ហាញការប្រើប្រាស់ការចោទប្រកាន់ផ្លូវព្រហ្មទណ្ឌមិនមែនជាកំហុសឬក៏ការយល់ដើម្បីបំបត្តិសហជីពតែឯករាជ្យណាឥឡូវតួនាទីរបស់ម៉ាកយីហោគឺមានសារៈសំខាន់ខ្លាំងក្រុមហ៊ុននេះគឺដេរឲ្យ ASIC និងMochi ផលិតផលពីរោងចក្រនេះគឺបានយកផលិតផលពីរោងចក្រនេះពួកគេត្រូវបានជូនដំណឹងគ្រប់ដំណាក់កាលអំពីការចាប់ខ្លួនការឃុំខ្លួនការសងសឹកជាបន្តបន្ទាប់ពីការដោះលែងឬក៏ការធ្វើទុកបុកម្នេញមកលើក្រុមគ្រួសាររបស់លោកជាច័ន្ទអស់រយៈពេល18 ខែដែលពួកគេមានឱកាសនៅក្នុងការបន្តបន្ទាប់ដើម្បីបង្ខំឲ្យអ្នកផ្គត់ផ្គង់នោះមកឈប់ការរំលោភបំពានឬក៏រកដំណោះស្រាយឲ្យដើម្បីឲ្យច័ន្ទទទួលបានយុត្តិធម៌ប៉ុន្តែពួកគេអស់រយៈពេលយ៉ាងយូរពួកគេមិនបានចាត់វិធានការច្បាស់ឬក៏ជាក់លាក់ណាមួយទេធ្វើឲ្យនយោជករំលោភសិទ្ធិទៅដល់អ្នកដែលចងក្រងសហជីពឯករាជ្យតាមតែអំពើចិត្តអញ្ចឹងណាការព្យាយាមនេះបានអនុញ្ញាតឲ្យមានការរំលោភ សិទ្ធិបន្តបន្ទាប់ធ្ងន់ធ្ងរឡើងនេះគឺជាឧទាហរណ៍យ៉ាងច្បាស់ការអនុវត្តការត្រួតពិនិត្យសិទ្ធិមនុស្សឬយឺតឬក៏ខ្សោយមិនត្រឹមតែបរាជ័យនៅក្នុងការបង្កឲ្យមានការខូចខាតទេប៉ុន្តែវាថែមទាំងអនុញ្ញាតឲ្យការបង្ក្រាបបន្តបន្ទាប់ទៅលើសិទ្ធិជាមូលដ្ឋានរបស់សហជីពតែសិទ្ធិជាមូលដ្ឋានរបស់កម្មករយោជិកដែលជាសិទ្ធិស្របច្បាប់របស់កម្មករយោជិកដែលយើងមានសិទ្ធិនៅក្នុងការចងក្រងតែបន្តពីមានការដាក់សម្ពាធនិងការចូលរួមយ៉ាងច្បាស់អំពីសហជីពឬក៏សមាគមរបស់កម្មករពីការទូពីសមាគមរបស់កម្មករពីដៃគូអន្តរជាតិដែលចូលរួមជាមួយនឹងការទូជាមិត្តភ័ក្តិអន្តរជាតិដែលចូលរួមមួយការទូទើបមានដំណោះស្រាយមួយបានកើតឡើងរហូតដល់មានការជាលទ្ធផលគឺច័ន្ទត្រូវបានដាក់ឲ្យត្រឡប់ទៅតួនាទីកន្លែងដើមរបស់គាត់ពេញលេញវិញតួនាទីជាមេដឹកនាំសហជីពហើយយើងក៏ទទួលបានសំណងចំនួន$50,000សម្រាប់ការឃុំខ្លួនហើយនឹងបូកជាមួយនឹងប្រាក់ប្រាក់ខែដែលគាត់នៅក្នុងការជាប់ពន្ធនាគាររយៈពេល6 ខែហ្នឹងហើយបន្ទាប់មកសហជីពក៏បានសហជីពនៅក្នុងសហជីពការទូនៅក្នុងចក្រវិនស្តាស៊ូហ្នឹងក៏ទទួលបាននៃការចុះបញ្ជីការជាផ្លូវការទទួលស្គាល់ដោយក្រសួងការងារនៅក្នុងដើមឆ្នាំ2025ផងដែរអញ្ចឹងណាក្នុងរយៈពេលតែប្រហែលសប្តាហ៍កម្មកររាប់រយនាក់បានចូលជាសមាជិករបស់ការទូហើយក៏បានឥឡូវនេះបច្ចុប្បន្នទាំងថ្នាក់ដឹកនាំនិងសកម្មជននៅរោងចក្រវិនស្តាស៊ូនឹងបន្តនៅក្នុងការរកសមាជិកជាបន្តបន្ទាប់ហើយកម្មករយោជិតក៏សម្រេចចិត្តនៅក្នុងការចូលរួមប៉ុន្តែអ្វីដែលជាការសោកស្ដាយសម្រាប់យើងដូចខ្ញុំបញ្ជាក់ខាងដើមអញ្ចឹងថាកម្មករយោជិតដែលយើងបានដាក់ទៅស្នើសុំឲ្យមានការកាត់ភាគទានរបស់កម្មករយោជិតហ្នឹងគឺមិនត្រូវបានក្រុមហ៊ុនចូលរួមនៅក្នុងការសហការនៅក្នុងការកាត់លុយភាគទានមកឲ្យសហជីពមូលដ្ឋាននៅរោងចក្រវិនស្តាស៊ូទេអញ្ចឹងណាករណីនេះគឺបានបង្ហាញដែលសំខាន់ខ្លាំងសូម្បីតែក្នុងបរិបទសង្គមស៊ីវិលកំពុងតែបង្រួមសូម្បីតែកន្លែងការងារដែលមានការចោទប្រកាន់បទព្រហ្មទណ្ឌត្រូវបានប្រើដើម្បីបិទសម្លេងកម្មដំណោះស្រាយនៅតែអាចកើតហើយវាមិនត្រឹមតែដោះស្រាយករណីលើកម្ពស់ស្តង់ដារការងារនៅក្នុងប្រព័ន្ធទាំងមូលវាស្ដារឡើងវិញនៅទំនុកចិត្តរបស់កម្មករថាតើការរៀបចំសហជីពអាចធ្វើទៅបានហើយវាផ្ញើសារមួយទៅកាន់រោងចក្រឬក៏ម៉ាកយីហោការសងសឹកនឹងមិនត្រូវអនុញ្ញាតឡើយក្នុងពេលដូចគ្នានេះដែរករណីក៏បង្ហាញថាការរងទុក្ខវេទនាជាច្រើនអាចត្រូវបានជៀសវាងប្រសិនបើម៉ាកយីហោចាត់វិធានការលឿនជាងនេះការខូចខាតមិនមែនជារឿងជៀសមិនរួចទេការចូលរួមរកដំណោះស្រាយនៅដំណាក់កាលដំបូងរបស់ក្រុមហ៊ុនគឺមានសារៈសំខាន់ណាស់អាចបញ្ឈប់ការចាប់ខ្លួនការខូចខាតដល់គ្រួសារនិងការសងសឹកយូរអង្វែងហេតុនេះការអនុវត្តការត្រួតពិនិត្យសិទ្ធិមនុស្សប្រកបដោយប្រសិទ្ធភាពត្រូវបានបង្កើតត្រូវបានឆ្លើយតបរហ័សដាក់វិធានការផ្ទាល់និងការបញ្ញាចិត្តពិតប្រាកដចំពោះដំណោះស្រាយជាពិសេសនៅក្នុងបរិបទបង្ក្រាបនៅចុងក្រោយក្នុងខ្ញុំចង់លើកឡើងពីមេរៀន2សំខាន់ទី1គឺការប្រើប្រាស់ការចោទប្រកាន់ប្រព័ន្ធតុលាការបទព្រហ្មទណ្ឌកំពុងត្រូវបានប្រើដោយចេតនាដើម្បីបំបិទសម្លេងរបស់កម្មករយោជិតទូទាំងប្រទេសឬក្នុងតំបន់វាជាឧបសគ្គចំពោះសេរីភាពសមាគមមិនមែនជាករណីបុគ្គលនោះទេទី2នៅពេលដែលក្រុមហ៊ុនត្រូវបានបង្ខំឲ្យទទួលខុសត្រូវយើងមើលឃើញថាកម្មករសហជីពត្រូវបានគ្រប់គ្រងដំណោះស្រាយមានន័យអាចកើតឡើងបានសូម្បីតែនៅក្នុងបរិបទពិបាកខ្លាំងក៏ដោយករណីនេះបង្ហាញថាការទទួលខុសត្រូវអាចទប់ស្កាត់ផលប៉ះពាល់នៃការបង្កើតបរិយាកាសភ័យខ្លាចដោយការចោទប្រកាន់ផ្លូវព្រហ្មទណ្ឌប៉ុន្តែវាបង្ហាញផងដែរថាត្រូវមានការរំពឹងទុកខ្ពស់ជាងនេះចំពោះម៉ាកយីហោ ដើម្បីចាត់វិធានការយ៉ាងលឿនដាច់ខាតជាប់លាប់ក្នុងការការពារសិទ្ធិកម្មករខ្ញុំគិតថាខ្ញុំសូមលើកប៉ុណ្ណឹងបងសុខុនខ្ញុំសូមចប់ប៉ុណ្ណឹងបងពួកគាត់មានសំណួរអាចសួរបានបង
Thank you so much, Sapon. That was brilliant as always. I'd also just like to say thank you to both of our translators for continuing to do this excellent work. Thank you, Sakan and Heyman. And yeah, you know, I just about that the case that Sapon just was talking about it at Wingstar Shoes. You know, it's really important to recognize that winning such cases like the case that she shared at Wingstar Shoes, getting those false charges dropped, you know, getting leaders out of jail, getting them reinstated, the impact of that in terms of how empowering it is really just can't be overstated, because just as criminalization is designed to convince workers that organizing is futile, that hope is misguided, that it is impossible to succeed, when victories like this occur in such incredibly constrained conditions, it essentially sends the opposite message to workers and to unions, not just in that country, but around the world, particularly given the increasing access to news that happens around the world. What we're going to do now is we're going to shift to really kind of explore how brands approach remedy. We'll have another go around, but we can also see some questions coming through. Please continue to add questions in, because we will very quickly shift over to answering those questions from all of you in the audience. But let me first perhaps share a couple of the general principles from the OECD guidelines when it comes to determining appropriate remedy. I think it's helpful to share this guidance because it's very strong and it's something that brands by and large have publicly committed to. So there are 4 principles that they go through. The first one is that remedy should seek to restore the affected person or persons to the situation that they would have been in had the harm not occurred, and that it needs to be proportionate to the significance and scale of the adverse impact. The second is that the remedy should meet national laws and international guidelines on remedy where available, and where such standards are not available, the remedy provided needs to be consistent with that provided through similar cases. And I wanted to share that as it was written because it's a very important point about the importance of precedent. And I think that's something that our speakers have all touched on to a degree. The company should engage with affected stakeholders in the determination of the remedy. Again, this is a very important point because in many of the cases that we see where criminalization has occurred, particularly in the form of false police cases, but certainly in other forms of retaliation as well, we see the brand taking their own call on what they determine remedy should be and largely absenting any kind of accountability to affected people or the unions who might be representing them. And the final point, the principle rather, that the OECD guidelines includes is that the company should assess the level of satisfaction of those who have raised complaints with the process and its outcome. And again, this is something that we very frequently fail to see when it comes to providing remedy. In this case that Sopon just shared at Wingstar Shoes, why this is really relevant, the point of precedent, is that when we're able to say that a worker was falsely imprisoned, as is the case of Mr. Chan at that factory, that when collectively we're able to ensure that, for example, $53,000 is paid to that worker, which of course any amount of money is insufficient to make up for the huge and awful ordeal that not only that worker has gone through, but the worker's family. In this case, as Sopon was saying, he has 3 children and a wife who are in really awful situation. And of course, then the 20,000 workers at that factory who are also being deprived of their ability to associate freely and stand up for their rights. So, yes, that is still a very minimal amount of money compared to really what he has gone through for 6 months, but it does set a very significant and important precedent for us to be able to point to if and when this sadly happens again, in order to hold brands accountable to what forms of remedy should be the floor. So before I move on to Myo Myo to share how she feels that brands should be responding in the situation that they're facing, both with the unionists that are still in prison at the moment, as well as with the workforce in general in Myanmar, I wanted to very quickly maybe double down on this point about precedent setting with a very brief example, which was going to be shared by a colleague of mine who unfortunately couldn't join us today. And this is the case of Hong Seng Knitting. This was a factory in Thailand where the WRC uncovered a wage theft scheme that was carried out by the factory in 2020. Broadly speaking, the factory coerced workers to acquiesce to this scheme and retaliated against workers who spoke out against it. Now, the violations themselves stemmed from the factory's desire to evade a law that sustains workers' incomes during period of low production, something that we saw in many countries around the world during the pandemic. So essentially a furlough-style pay of a percentage of the overall pay. And under this law, if a factory temporarily suspends workers, it has to pay them a reduced wage. So workers have some income to support themselves and families. And this is, of course, something that is important for all workers in the context of wages being so incredibly low, but is very important when it comes to migrant workers, for example, Burmese migrant workers in Thailand, who not only are struggling to support themselves, but also send remittances back home. So in avoiding paying, the way that this took place was management compelling workers to sign a form falsely stating that they wanted to take voluntary unpaid leave, that is to cede their ability to say that they want to receive the pay that's owed to them. Now, we receive a lot of questions, and I think a lot of the unions who are on the panel also receive questions about a huge amount of time and effort that ends up being focused on the reinstatement or the remedy for one or two or three unionized workers. And I think the answer that we all have is the same. And that's really about how this is, really a David and Goliath battle around precedent setting, around, on one side, the forces of criminalization and repression and intimidation against workers who attempt to assert their rights. And on the other side, the ability to be able to say that it's still possible to win, that remedy is possible, that assertion of rights is possible, and that freedom of association can be protected in accordance with the codes of conducts and the commitments publicly made by brands. And in this case, I'm cutting a long story short because I'm aware of the time. After more than 5 years of pushing the brand Nike in this situation to acknowledge that a violation had occurred, which was something that was seen as in contention, and something that I would like to say is reminiscent of every one of these cases that we've talked about today. For example, in the case of Wingstar shoes in Cambodia, the brands then Muji and Asics were questioning whether the false police complaint and the subsequent imprisonment of the worker was indeed a violation of freedom of association or not. And similarly, in this case, in Thailand, it was a similar question of whether or not a violation had occurred, despite the fact that it seemed abundantly clear to us that this certainly had occurred. Now, at the end of this, what we did see was a remediation plan announced by Nike in February last year, finally acknowledging that workers' rights were indeed violated and that compensation was due. So the compensation plan did call for workers to receive 100% of lost wages. What that didn't see was the payment of legally mandated interest in Thailand of 15%, which is accrued. But what we did see, and which is particularly relevant for this conversation, is the compensation for the worker. His name is Kya San U, and he's also given permission to use and publicize the amount of compensation that he received for this ordeal, where after the factory filed a complaint, he was forced to flee. and the amount that has since been paid to him is $42,000. And again, that's an incredible precedent to have been set despite the extraordinary amount of time that has elapsed in being able to see this kind of justice be arrived at. It's vastly more than the amount that was originally going to be paid, which was $1,800, of course, insufficient given what the worker and his wife, who was also a worker, had gone through. And I think, of course, we really welcomed the reversal of that position that was held for nearly 5 years. But I think, in answering the question that we frequently received about this case, about why we persisted for so long, it was with an awareness that I think, all of the union sisters on this call recognize, which is that the implications when it comes to brand responses to violations or how they decide to remediate have implications that stretch much further beyond individual factory cases. If a retaliation against one worker leader can go unremediated, it sends a very clear message, not only to brands, but to factories, that this is something that they can do and get away with it with impunity. That's why it's incredibly important that in response to these efforts to criminalize workers or criminalize dissent or any kind of worker protest or strikes, that the remedy is pursued and that brands are made to shift position. Where, of course, we do have examples of where brands much more swiftly act, but what we have recognized lately is a very troubling trend of brands being very slow to step up and recognize their responsibility. I'd like to maybe go to Myo as I'm seeing some questions come through, to maybe share some more about what she feels that brands can do in the situation that is ongoing there for her comrades that are currently in the insane prison in Myanmar. And so, yeah, Myo, if you can share what your thoughts are on the brands that choose to continue sourcing from Myanmar and what they can do in the face of the law being used to silence dissent.
မိကွန်းတဲ့ကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်လက်ရှိမှာပေါ့နော်ကျမတို့အနေနဲ့ကဖြစ်ချင်းမှာတော့ဘာဖြစ်သွားလဲဆိုတော့ရုံးခန်းတွေလည်းပိတ်ခံထားရတယ်ကျမရဲ့လုံနေတဲ့အရင်းမြစ်တွေအားလုံးပေါ့ဟိုမှာဆက်သွယ်ဖို့ဖုန်းလို့အားလုံးရုပ်ပိုင်းဆိုင်ရာပြီးလို့ရှိရင်လူအနေနဲ့ပြောမယ်ဆိုရင်လည်းတမကတွေအားလုံးကိုကျမတို့အဖြုတ်ခွဲခန့်ရတယ်ကျမရဲ့ member တမကတွေဆိုလို့ရှိရင်လိုက်ဖမ်းတာတွေအလုပ်ဖြုတ်တာတွေဆက်တိုက်လုပ်သွားတယ်အဲ့တော့brand တွေအနေနဲ့ကဒါကိုမြန်မာပြည်မှာပေါ့နော်ကျမတို့အဖွဲ့ကိုအဲ့ဒီလိုလုပ်ပြီးလို့သိပြီးတဲ့အချိန်ကနေစပြီးရောယခုချိန်ထိဆက်သွယ်လာပြီးတော့ပေါ့နော်ဘယ်လိုမျိုးလုပ်ပေးရမလဲပေါ့ဆိုတဲ့စကားလုံးမျိုးခုချိန်ထိကျမကိုဆက်သွယ်ပြီးပြောဆိုတာမရှိသေးဘူးတရားစွဲဆိုတဲ့ brand ကဝါရှင်တန်ကအရှိထွက်ပြီးတော့တရားစွဲတာပေါ့သို့တော်လည်းအဲ့လိုတရားစွဲဖို့အတွက်ပံ့ပိုးကူညီတဲ့garment sector က brand တွေရှိတယ်စက်ရုံတွေရှိတယ်ပေါ့နော်သူတို့ကmake project မှာပါဝင်တဲ့စက်ရုံတွေဖြစ်တယ်သူတို့ကိုယ်တိုင်ကိုအားကိုဒါအားပေးအားမြောက်ပြုနေတယ်ဆိုတဲ့အနေအထားမျိုးတွေ့ရတယ်ဘာလို့လဲဆိုလို့ရှိရင်တရားရုံးမှာတက်တည်လာထွက်သွားကျမတို့ကိုဘယ်လိုကုစားမှုမျိုးပေးမလဲဒီလူတွေအဖမ်းခံနေရတာကိုလွတ်မြောက်အောင်ဘယ်လိုလုပ်မလဲဆိုပြီးတော့မကူညီတဲ့အပြင်ကိုပို့ပြီးတော့ကျမတို့ကိုလေးအောင်ပေါ့နော်တရားရုံးမှာတက်တည်လာထွက်သွားတာညာရှိခဲ့တယ်ပေါ့နော်ကျမတို့ဖွဲ့ကတရားမဝင်အဖွဲ့အစည်းဖြစ်တယ်ကျမတို့ကစုပေါင်းတောင်းဆိုမှုတွေကိုဥဆောင်တယ်ကျမတို့ကြောင့်သူတို့တွေကbrand တွေ order တွေနောက်ဆုတ်သွားတယ်ဆိုတော့ဒီလိုမျိုးဆွဆွဲချက်တွေရှိတယ်ပေါ့အဲ့တော့လွတ်လပ်စွာတင်မင်းဖွဲ့စည်းခွင့်ဖွဲ့စည်းထားတဲ့အဖွဲ့အစည်းတွေကိုတရားမကျန်အလုပ်ကနေဖြုတ်ပစ်တာမျိုးဖြုတ်ပြီးတဲ့နောက်ပိုင်းမှာလည်းစစ်မှုထမ်းဆိုတဲ့မြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာအရန်ကိုဘယ်လိုပြောမလဲလူတကာကြောက်ရွံ့တယ်ပေါ့လူငယ်တွေကြောက်ရွံ့တဲ့စစ်မှုထမ်းဆိုတဲ့ပုံမှန်နဲ့ချက်ချင်းကိုကျမကိုဖမ်းတဲ့ညမှာပဲဖမ်းဆီးလိုက်တာပို့လိုက်တာပေါ့နော်တခြားလူတွေဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ဒါမြို့နယ်ဥက္ကဋ္ဌဆိုလို့ရှိရင်ဝင်ဖမ်းတဲ့အတွေ့အမှုကိုဝင်ဖမ်းတယ်ထပ်ပြီးလွတ်မြောက်သွားတယ်သူတို့တွေဆိုလို့ရှိရင်လည်းသူတို့ရဲ့မိသားစုတွေကဒုက္ခရောက်တာသူ သူတို့ရဲ့လောက်ခလာစားကိုမှီပြီးတော့မိသားစုကစားတောင်းညာအဲ့တော့သူတို့ကအဝေးကိုထွက်ပြေးသွားတယ်အခုဆိုစစ်ဖြစ်နေတဲ့ဒေသမှာသူတို့ကရောက်သွားတယ်သူတို့ရဲ့မိဘတွေအသက်ဆုံးသွားတယ်သူတို့အသက်မမှီကြဘူးပေါ့နော်အဲ့တော့ဒီလိုအခြေအနေမျိုးအတွက်ဘယ်လိုကုစားမှုမျိုးဘယ်သူကလုပ်ပေးမှာလဲသူတို့အလုပ်ဖြုတ်လိုက်တာတော့မှ brand ကယခုအချိန်ထိအလုပ်ထုတ်နေတာကြီးတို့နော်ဒီတမကဖြိုခွဲမှုနဲ့ပတ်သက်တဲ့တာဝန်ယူမှုတို့တခုမှမလုပ်သေးတဲ့အပြင်နောက်ထပ်တစ်ခုထပ်ကျူးလွန်တာပေါ့နော်အဲ့တော့ကျူးလွန်ပြီးရင်ကျူးလွန်ရင်ကျူးလွန်ပြီးရင်ကျူးလွန်ရင်ကျူးလွန်နေတာကိုဘာလို့နှုတ်ဆက်နေကြကျမတို့မကူညီတဲ့အပြင်ကိုထပ်တိုးပြီးတော့အဖြစ်တွေပိုကြီးအောင်အဖြစ်တွေပိုလီးအောင်လုပ်နေရပေါ့နော်ဒါတွေတော့ကျမတို့တော်တော်စိတ်မကောင်းဖြစ်တယ်ဒီ brand တွေကဒီအများမြင်တဲ့မျက်နှာစာမှာပေါ့အရန်ကိုကောင်းတဲ့စကားလုံးတွေပြောတယ်လူတွေကအရန်အားကြလောက်တဲ့စကားလုံးတွေပေါ့နော်လူခွင့်ရေးဆိုတဲ့စကားလုံးတွေတွင်တွင်ကျယ်ကျယ်ပြောတယ်သူတို့ကဒီ CSR ကိုဘယ်လိုလုပ်နေပါလဲဘယ်နေရာတွေမှာဘယ်လောက်လှူနေပါလဲဘယ်ဆက်ယုံနေမှာဘယ်လိုတွေလုပ်ပေးနေပါလဲငလျင်အတွက်ဘယ်လောက်လှူတယ်အဲ့လိုမျိုးပေါ့နော်လူမြင်ကောင်းတဲ့ဒီအပြတွေအရန်လုပ်တယ်ပေါ့နော်အဲ့လိုမျိုးလေးပြတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့ right ပေါ့အခွင့်အရေးနဲ့ပတ်သက်ရင်တော့ချိုးဖောက်တယ်ယခုချိန်ကြီးချိုးဖောက်နေတယ် brand ကြီးတွေချိုးဖောက်နေတယ်ဘယ်က brand မှမသိဘူးလာချုပ်နေတယ်ဆိုတာတဲ့တကယ် brand ကြီးတွေချိုးဖောက်နေတယ်မြန်မာနိုင်ငံကနေထွက်သွားပါပြီဆိုပြီးကြေညာထားတဲ့ brand တွေကချိုးဖောက်နေတယ်ဒါတွေကိုထုတ်ဖို့ပြောဆိုလို့ကျမနဲ့ကျမအဖွဲ့ကအခုလိုမျိုးခံရတာပေါ့နော်အဲ့လိုခံရတာမှလည်းကျမတို့ကူပေးမဲ့လူဗမာပြည်ထဲမှာကျမတို့အကာအကွယ်ပေးမဲ့သူတယောက်မှမရှိဘူးရှင့်ကျမတို့စီကိုလာခဲ့တဲ့အလုပ်သမားတွေပေါ့နော်ကျမတို့အဖွဲ့ဝင်အလုပ်သမားတွေ member အလုပ်သမားတွေလာခဲ့တဲ့ဆိုရင်တော့မှတခြားသူတွေကနေပြီးတော့ကျမတို့နဲ့ပတ်သက်လို့ရှိရင်ထောင်ကြမယ်တို့အဖမ်းခံရမယ်တို့မပတ်သက်နဲ့လို့ဆိုတဲ့စကားလုံးတွေကိုစက်ရုံတွေကိုယ်တိုင် brand တွေကိုယ်တိုင်ထုတ်ပြောတယ်ရုံးချိန်တွေမှာ union တွေကနေကျမတို့ကိုသွေးစည်းညီညွတ်မှုကိုပြတာတယ်လာပြီးဝင်းရတဲ့အချိန်မှာHR တွေက group ကနေပြီးတော့ဒီနေ့ခွင့်မပေးနဲ့ဖြတ်တဲ့တမကအောင်လောက်ကထုတ်လောက်ခလာစာဖြတ်တော့ညီမျိုးစုံနဲ့ဖိနှိပ်ထားတာပေါ့နော်ဒါတွေကိုအန်တုပြီးတော့ကျမတို့ဘက်ကနေလာဇက်တိနေတဲ့တမကတွေအတွက်လည်းချက်အထာကလည်းအရင်စိုးရိမ်စရာကောင်းတယ်ဘာဖြစ်လို့လဲဆိုတော့ဒီစစ်မှုထမ်းဥပဒေရဲ့အောက်မှာသူတို့ကအာခံပြီးထွက်လာခဲ့ကြတာအခုချိန်ကြီးဖြုတ်နေတဲ့တမကအဖွဲ့ဝင်တွေပြီးလို့ရှိရင်ဒီအဖိနှိပ်ခံနေရတယ်ကျမတို့ရဲ့အလုပ်သမားတွေအတွက်ပေါ့အတန်ထွက်ဖို့လိုတယ်ဗရန်တွေဘက်ကတိတ်ဆိတ်နေတယ်မတရားမှုတွေကိုတွန်းအားပေးနေတယ်ပေါ့နော်ကျမဒါပဲပြောချင်ပါတယ်ဒါကကျမတို့အဖွဲ့အစည်းမှာမြင်သာတဲ့အနေအထားပေါ့ဘယ်ဗရန်ကမှလာပြီးတော့ SUN ကခုလိုမတရားမှုခံနေရတာပါလားဘယ်အဖွဲ့အစည်းကလာပြီးမတရားမှုခံနေရတာပါလားထုတ်ဖို့ပြောဆိုခြင်းရှိဘူးပေါ့နော်ကျမနဲ့ဒီအမြဲတမ်းသူရက်တည်ပေးနေတဲ့အဖွဲ့အစည်းတွေကလွှဲရင်လုပ်ငန်းရှင်အတိုင်းဝိုင်းပေါ့နော်အခြားသောဒီ INGO အတိုင်းဝိုင်းပေါ့ဒီနိုင်ငံတကာအတိုင်းဝိုင်းတွေကစိတ်ရှုနိုင်တယ်နှုတ်စိတ်နေလုံးအားကြီးတယ်လို့ကျမဘက်ကတော့ပြောချင်တယ်အဲ့တော့ brand အနေနဲ့ကကျမတို့မှာမိသားစု10စုကိုမိခိုနေတယ်အဲ့မိသားစု10စုအပြင်ကျမတို့အဖွဲ့ကြီးကဒီလိုမျိုးဖြစ်သွားတဲ့အတွက်ကြောင့်တော့ကျမရဲ့အဖွဲ့ဝင် union တွေကပို့ပြီးတော့ထိခိုက်တယ်သူတို့အလုပ်ဖြုတ်ခံရတာလေမိသားစုဆုံးရှုံးတာလေကျန်းမာရေးကစေးမကူနိုင်တာလေတိုက်ပွဲထဲမှာပိတ်မိနေတာလေဒါတွေဟာအခုလောက်ရကြောင်းအကျိုးဆက်ကြောင့်ဖြစ်တယ်ဆိုတာကိုကျမကပြောချင်တယ်ရှင်
Thank you so much, Mia, for sharing that. And I think, it's such an important message for people to hear in terms of what the role of the brands have been in this situation. I think it doesn't really get any more pointed than these kinds of complaints leading to arrests and imprisonment in the context of a country that's been run by a military junta. And yet what we have seen, as Myanmar has shared, is a lot of indifference from brands when it comes to their response to this. And this is despite the fact that, of course, in choosing to operate in a country like Myanmar, despite the political context, that of course it requires heightened due diligence. That is made abundantly clear by a range of different commitments that brands make. And despite that, and despite it, of course, being a very obvious and predictable risk, not only was the risk not mitigated in this situation, but once the harm had been incurred, the response has been incredibly limited, despite the fact that these complaints can be linked directly to factories that are producing for international brands. And very sadly, that is something that we have seen in all of these cases that have been discussed today, that despite the commitments made by brands, despite how predictable a lot of these situations are and the use of the law in this very troubling way, that the response from brands has been woefully inadequate. And I think it's one thing to see that as a passive response from brands, but in a context where they are aware of the significant leverage that they have over their suppliers who they have a business relationship with, and in many of these cases fail to use that as a way to ensure that rights are respected. It's very concerning, particularly in the context of growing authoritarianism around the world and a need to coordinate responses on how production needs to continue in the eyes of brands despite this situation. I'm aware we've just got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to go to a question to Sapon, and then we'll do maybe a couple of the questions before we have to wrap up from the audience. Just to Sapon, I wanted to follow up on one of the points that was made, and I can also see that that people have asked questions about this, which is about something that you touched on earlier, the impact on workers when the independence of institutions like the Arbitration Council in Cambodia, when that is damaged. Can you give an example of how that that impacts workers, and maybe use the example of a particular case?
Cha អរគុណច្រើនធូស៊ីតាមពិតបើយើងក៏លេចទៅមើលបទពិសោធន៍នៅក្នុងប្រទេសកម្ពុជាខ្ញុំអាចនិយាយបានថាអ្វីដែលសំខាន់បំផុតទៅលើរឿងដែលបានកើតឡើងដែលពាក់ព័ន្ធមួយជុំវិញនៃសំណួរខ្ញុំសំណួរធូស៊ីបានលើកឡើងឬក៏ជុំវិញទៅលើបរិបទរឿងករណីក្រុមហ៊ុនវិសាស៊ូខ្ញុំគិតថាទីមួយគឺក្រុមហ៊ុនម៉ាកយីហោអាចទាំងធ្វើដើម្បីមានការគ្រប់គ្រងទៅដល់សេរីភាពសហជីពសមាគមគឺត្រូវចាត់ធានការយ៉ាងលឿនច្បាស់ជាក់លាក់និងជាសាធារណៈទៅលើការសងសឹកដែលអាចកើតឡើងហ្នឹងខ្ញុំគិតថាវាជាសារសំខាន់មែនទែនហើយនៅក្នុងពេលដែលមេដឹកនាំកម្មករត្រូវបានចោទប្រកាន់ពីបទព្រហ្មទណ្ឌគឺម៉ាកយីហោត្រូវតែទាមទារទៅអ្នកផ្គត់ផ្គង់ហ្នឹងឲ្យដកពាក្យបណ្ដឹងខ្លែងបណ្ដឹងអាចថាឲ្យដកពាក្យបណ្ដឹងមិនតាន់ជុំវិញនៃបណ្ដឹងដែលបានដាក់មកលើកម្មករខ្ញុំអាចនិយាយបានថាជាបណ្ដឹងខ្លែងខ្លាយគឺបណ្ដឹងដែលចោទប្រកាន់មិនត្រឹមត្រូវអញ្ចឹងណាដែលដាក់មកឲ្យឬក៏ដាក់កម្មករនិយោជិតហ្នឹងឲ្យគាត់ត្រឡប់ទៅទូនាទីដើមរបស់គាត់វិញឬក៏ការផ្ដល់សំណងហ្នឹងពេញលេញទៅដល់ពួកគាត់ដើម្បីឲ្យគាត់អាចថាមានសំណងទាំងប្រាក់ខែទាំងសំណងដែលការបាត់បង់ជំនឿចិត្តដែលគាត់មានការឃុំខ្លួនគាត់ដែលឬក៏ប៉ះពាល់ទៅដល់សុខភាពរបស់គាត់អញ្ចឹងណាបើសិនណាការនៅបន្តស្ងៀមស្ងាត់គឺឬក៏ការមិនឆ្លើយឬក៏ការឆ្លើយតបយឺតហ្នឹងគឺជាការបញ្ជូនសារមួយយ៉ាងច្បាស់ទៅលើរោងចក្រថាជាការប្រក្រាបឬក៏ការអនុញ្ញាតឲ្យមានការរំលោភបំពានជុំវិញនេះសំណួរដែលធូស៊ីសួរថាផលប៉ះពាល់សហជីពឯករាជ្យទៅលើអាជ្ញាកណ្ដាលទៅលើអីផ្សេងហ្នឹងកន្លែងហ្នឹងខ្ញុំអាចនិយាយបានថានៅពេលដែលមានបញ្ហាកើតឡើងបរិបទស្រុកខ្មែរហ្នឹងគឺក្រសួងការងារគេអត់បានបញ្ជូនរឿងហ្នឹងទៅដល់ក្រមប្រឹក្សាអាជ្ញាកណ្ដាលដើម្បីធ្វើការកាត់សេចក្តីអីទេអញ្ចឹងណា នៅពេលដែលមានរឿងស្ថានភាពនឹងកើតឡើងគឺយើងបានប្តឹងទៅក្រសួងដែរប៉ុន្តែគេហៅក្នុងការដោះស្រាយដែរប៉ុន្តែគេអាចបានបញ្ជូនសំណុំរឿងហ្នឹងទៅដល់ក្រុមប្រឹក្សាអាជ្ញាកណ្ដាលដើម្បីធ្វើការដោះស្រាយទេខ្ញុំគិតថាកន្លែងនេះវាជាការអឺបិទសិទ្ធិសេរីភាពរបស់កម្មករនិយោជិតឬក៏សហជីពដែលអាចនិយាយបានថាយើងមានសិទ្ធិពេញលេញនៅពេលមានបញ្ហាកើតឡើងយើងស្វែងរកដំណោះស្រាយប៉ុន្តែវាអត់បានទទួលបានដំណោះស្រាយវាទៅជាគេផ្អាប់រឿងទុកនៅនឹងដើម្បីធ្វើការដោះស្រាយដោយគេចាត់ទុកថារឿងនេះវាជារឿងថ្នាក់ដឹកនាំវាជារឿងអីទៅហើយវាជារឿងព្រហ្មទណ្ឌនៃជាដើមអញ្ចឹងគេអត់បានបញ្ជូនរឿងហ្នឹងទៅអាជ្ញាកណ្ដាលទេអញ្ចឹងណាខ្ញុំសូមលើកបន្តថាត្រឡប់មកពីក្រុមហ៊ុនម៉ាកយីហោត្រូវតែចាត់ទុកការប្រើប្រាស់ការចាត់ប្រកាន់ផ្លូវព្រហ្មទណ្ឌហ្នឹងជាសញ្ញាណហានិភ័យខ្ពស់នៅក្នុងការត្រួតពិនិត្យសិទ្ធិមនុស្សណាខ្ញុំយល់ឃើញថាធម្មតាពាក្យមិនដឹងដែលចាត់ប្រកាន់ខ្លែងបន្លំទៅដល់រហូតដល់មានការចាប់ខ្លួនការយាយីការរំខានផ្លូវច្បាប់មិនត្រូវឲ្យមានចង់និយាយថាត្រូវតែមានការចូលរួមដំណោះស្រាយបន្ទាន់មិនត្រូវចង់និយាយថាមិនមែនត្រឹមតែមានការត្រួតពិនិត្យធម្មតាដូចជាទូទៅដែលយើងមើលឃើញថានៅពេលដែលមានបញ្ហាកើតឡើងគឺក្រុមហ៊ុនម៉ាកយីហោគ្រាន់តែមានការត្រួតពិនិត្យធម្មតាទេអញ្ចឹងណាហើយលើសពីការឆ្លើយតបជាក់លាក់ហ្នឹងគឺបានលើកឡើងនីមួយៗហ្នឹងម៉ាកយីហោគួរតែទាមទារឲ្យមានការគោរពសហជីពតែឯករាជ្យនិងគ្រប់គ្រងទៅលើការចុះបញ្ជីសហជីពដើម្បីឲ្យសហជីពអាចដំណើរការសកម្មភាពស្របច្បាប់របស់ខ្លួនអញ្ចឹងណាហើយមួយទៀតដែររួមបញ្ចូលទាំងការការពារសេរីភាពសមាគមយ៉ាងខ្លាំងនៅក្នុងកិច្ចសន្យាជាមួយនឹងអ្នកផ្គត់ផ្គង់អញ្ចឹងណាយើងស្នើសុំបែបហ្នឹងហើយមួយទៀតហ្នឹងការដាក់វិធានការផ្ទាល់ឬក៏ផលវិបាកពិតប្រាកដនៅពេលដែលមានការសងសឹកពីអ្នកផ្គត់ផ្គង់ឬក៏ម៉ាកយីហោអាជីវកម្មហ្នឹងប្រសិនបើមានការរំលោភនៅតែបន្តអញ្ចឹងណាជាពិសេសនៅក្នុងករណី Winstar Su នៅក្នុងករណីរឿងចាក់ Winstar Su ហ្នឹងយើងឃើញថាក្រុមហ៊ុននៅតែមានការសងសឹកមកលើសហជីពឯករាជ្យពិតប្រាកដការពារសិទ្ធិកម្មករពិតប្រាកដបន្តទៀតជាពិសេសអ្វីដែលខ្ញុំបានលើកឡើងមុនហ្នឹងគឺនៅពេលដែលសហជីពមានបញ្ជីការហើយយើងចាប់ដើមនៅក្នុងការប្រមូលសមាជិកយើងឃើញថាក្រុមហ៊ុនមិនទទួលយកការកាត់លុយភាគទានមកឲ្យសហជីពហើយមួយទៀតហ្នឹងគឺអត់បន្តនៅក្នុងការកាត់លុយភាគទានដែលកន្លែងហ្នឹងច្បាប់បានសរសេរច្បាស់មែនទែនថាតួនាទីរបស់ក្រុមហ៊ុននៅពេលដែលកម្មករនិយោជិករបស់យើងនឹងបានចូលរួមបិទមេដៃសម្រាប់ចិត្តនៅក្នុងការចូលរួមសមាជិកភាពរបស់សហជីពហើយផ្ញើទៅឲ្យក្រុមហ៊ុនគឺក្រុមហ៊ុនមានកាតព្វកិច្ចមួយត្រូវតែកាត់ផ្លូវច្បាប់ណាត្រូវតែកាត់លុយភាគទានទៅតាមសំណើរបស់កម្មករដែលបានដាក់ទៅក្រុមហ៊ុនមកឲ្យសហជីពនឹងប៉ុន្តែទៅជាក្រុមហ៊ុនហ្នឹងគឺអត់កាត់លុយអត់ធ្វើការកាត់លុយភាគទានហ្នឹងមកឲ្យសហជីពទេខ្ញុំថាហ្នឹងគឺជាការសងសឹកគឺជាការយាយខ្លាំងមែនទែនដែលទៅលើការចូលរួមជាសមាជិកភាពរបស់សហជីពអញ្ចឹងណាខ្ញុំគិតថានេះជាការសងសឹកបន្តទៀតមកលើសហជីពហើយមួយទៀតដែរពាក់ព័ន្ធជាមួយនឹងការសហការជាមួយនឹងតំណាងកម្មករដែលមានភាពគួរតែទុកចិត្តឬក៏ត្រួតពិនិត្យឯករាជ្យដើម្បីទៀងទាត់ស្ថានភាពជាក់លាក់ចឹងក្រោយខ្ញុំស្នើសុំឲ្យម៉ាកយីហោត្រូវតែទទួលស្គាល់ថាដំណោះស្រាយមិនជាជំរើសទេគឺនៅក្នុងបរិបទបង្ក្រាបដូចនៅកម្ពុជាគឺចូលរួមដំណើរការទៅកាន់ដំណោះស្រាយគឺជាអ្វីដែលបានស្ដារឡើងវិញនៅទំនុកចិត្តរបស់កម្មករក្នុងការរៀបចំសហជីពដែលឯករាជ្យការពារកំពុងឲ្យមានផលប៉ះពាល់នៃការបង្កើតបរិយាកាសភ័យខ្លាចរីករាលដាលបន្តទៀតអញ្ចឹងណាហើយចំណុចមួយទៀតដែលខ្ញុំចង់លើកឡើងគឺករណីរបស់យើងបានបង្ហាញថានៅពេលដែលម៉ាកយីហោត្រូវបានបង្ខំឲ្យចាត់វិធានការសេរីភាពសមាគមត្រូវបានស្ដារឡើងវិញប៉ុន្តែវាក៏បង្ហាញផងដែរថាការពន្យាពេលបង្កឲ្យមានការខូចខាតយ៉ាងធ្ងន់ធ្ងរដូច្នេះសារសំខាន់ច្បាស់ជាក់លាក់ពីខ្ញុំការចាត់វិធានការរហ័សការនឹងដាច់ខាតរបស់ក្រុមហ៊ុនគឺជាការការពារសិទ្ធិកម្មករនិយោជិតការឆ្លើយតបទន់ខ្សោយយឺតយ៉ាវគឺអនុញ្ញាតឲ្យមានការបង្ក្រាបឬក៏ឲ្យកម្មករនិយោជិតយើងនោះអាចប្រើប្រាស់សិទ្ធិបានខ្ញុំមានប៉ុណ្ណឹងអរគុណ
Thank you so much, Sapon. They were such powerful words that I feel like that's actually the perfect ending for us. Thanks to everyone for the questions on chat and to my colleagues and others who were answering in chat as well. And thanks to all of you for attending. This session has been recorded, so the recording will be available via the OECD website as well as our own website. If there are any other questions that people have, please direct the questions to myself or the panelists to me, and I can pass them on. We won't be handing out the emails for security reasons, but of course, welcome any further engagement. Sorry for ending a few minutes late, but a huge thank you again to our brilliant panelists for joining, and to Nazma in her absence, and to the interpreters. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the forum.